Throughout history, no profession had a higher death rate than 18th century seafaring. More than half of those who boarded ships never returned home. So why did people who knew how dangerous it was continue to board ships? And what exactly were they experiencing out there? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The 18th century was the golden age of sail, when massive wooden ships crossed the world's oceans carrying trade goods, passengers, and dreams of fortune. But behind the romantic image of billowing sails and brave explorers lay a reality so brutal that modern people can barely comprehend it. This is the story of what life was really like for the thousands of men who spent months or years at sea, facing conditions that would be considered torture by today's standards. Most men didn't choose the sea chose them. In the grimy taverns and back alleys of 18th century port cities like Portsmouth, Bristol, and Boston, naval recruiters and merchant captains hunted for bodies to fill their ships. They weren't looking for experienced sailors, they just needed anyone desperate enough to sign their life away for a few shillings and the promise of adventure. The majority of new sailors were running from something. Debt was the most common reason men who owed money they couldn't repay saw a ship as their only escape from debtor's prison. Others were fleeing the law, having committed crimes that would earn them a noose if they stayed on land. Some were simply starving, victims of crop failures or economic downturns who saw naval service as their only chance for regular meals. The recruitment process itself was often barely legal. Press gangs roamed coastal towns, literally kidnapping men and forcing them into service. A healthy-looking man walking near the docks might find himself surrounded by naval officers and given a simple choice: volunteer for the Navy and receive a signing bonus, or be pressed into service anyway and get nothing. Either way, he was going to sea. Young men were particularly vulnerable. Boys as young as 12 were taken from their families, supposedly as apprentices who would learn valuable skills. In reality, they became the lowest members of a brutal hierarchy, where survival depended on quickly learning to endure abuse and hardship that would break most adults. The moment a new recruit stepped aboard ship, his old life ended completely. Naval discipline was absolute and unforgiving. The captain was literally the law. He could order floggings, impose bread and water rations, or even sentence a man to death for serious offenses. There was no appeal, no higher authority to complain to, and no escape until the voyage ended. The ship's hierarchy was rigid and brutal. At the top sat the captain, followed by officers who lived in relative comfort in the stern quarters. Below them were the petty officers, boatswain's mates, quartermasters, and skilled craftsmen like carpenters and sailmakers, who enjoyed slightly better treatment and accommodations. At the bottom were the ordinary seamen and the ship's boys, who endured the worst conditions and did the most dangerous work. New sailors quickly learned that the ship operated on a system of institutionalized violence. Flogging was the standard punishment for even minor infractions. A man could receive dozens of lashes with a cat-o'-nine-tails for being late to his watch, speaking disrespectfully to an officer, or showing any sign of hesitation in carrying out orders. The cat-o'-nine-tails itself was a fearsome weapon. 9 knotted cords attached to a wooden handle that could strip flesh from bone with just a few strokes. The psychological shock of this new reality was overwhelming for most recruits. Men who had lived their entire lives on land suddenly found themselves trapped in a wooden prison surrounded by endless water, subject to absolute authority, and facing months or years of unimaginable hardship. Many experienced what modern psychologists would recognize as severe depression and anxiety, but in the 18th century, such conditions were simply considered weakness or malingering. Sleep became a precious commodity that was never truly restful. Sailors were divided into watches that kept the ship operating around the clock. A man might work 4 hours, sleep 4 hours, then work another 4 hours, with this cycle continuing for months. The sleeping quarters, called the forecastle, were cramped, dark, and filled with the stench of unwashed bodies, bilge water, and rotting food. The hammocks where sailors slept were slung so close together that men literally rubbed shoulders with their neighbors. Privacy was non-existent. The air was thick and stifling, made worse by the fact that hatches were often battened down during storms, trapping dozens of men in a space barely fit for a few. Seasickness was universal among new sailors, and the smell of vomit mixed with all the other odors to create an atmosphere that defied description. Food quality dropped to subsistence levels almost immediately after leaving port. The ship's stores included salt pork that was often years old, hardtack biscuits infested with weevils, and water that quickly became foul and slimy. Rats were everywhere, eating precious food supplies and contaminating everything they touched. Some sailors actually welcomed the rats as a source of fresh meat when their regular rations ran low. The work itself was backbreaking and dangerous beyond modern comprehension. Sailors had to climb rigging that swayed wildly in rough seas, often in darkness or bad weather. A single misstep meant a fall that would likely be fatal. The ropes and sails were so heavy that it took multiple men working in perfect coordination to manage them, and exhausted or inexperienced sailors were a danger to themselves and everyone around them. Canvas sails, when wet, became incredibly heavy and difficult to handle. In storms, sailors had to venture onto swaying yards high above the deck to furl sails that fought against them like living things. Men regularly fell to their deaths or were swept overboard by waves that crashed over the deck without warning. Those who fell into the sea rarely survived. Ships couldn't easily turn around to rescue them, and few sailors could swim anyway. The medical care available on ships was primitive even by 18th century standards. Ship surgeons were often failed doctors, barbers with minimal training, or men with no medical knowledge at all. Their tools were crude, their understanding of infection non-existent, and their ability to treat serious injuries limited to amputation and prayer. Minor injuries frequently became life-threatening infections. A small cut could develop into gangrene, requiring amputation of entire limbs. Men who might have recovered from their injuries on land died from infections that spread unchecked in the ship's unsanitary conditions. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, with the patient held down by his shipmates while the surgeon sawed through bone and flesh. After the initial shock of boarding ship wore off, sailors settled into a daily routine that was monotonous, exhausting, and punctuated by moments of pure terror. The rhythm of shipboard life revolved around the changing of watches, the distribution of rations, and the endless maintenance required to keep a wooden vessel seaworthy in hostile ocean conditions. The daily food ration was a cruel joke that barely sustained life. Each sailor received about a pound of salt pork or beef per day, though this meat was often so old and poorly preserved that it resembled leather more than food. The salt used for preservation was so concentrated that the meat had to be soaked in seawater before cooking, which removed some nutrients along with the excess salt. Hardtack, the staple bread of naval life, came in the form of thick, dense biscuits that were baked months or even years before consumption. These biscuits were invariably infested with weevils, small beetles whose larvae consumed the interior of the biscuit and left it hollow. Sailors learned to tap their hardtack against the table before eating it, listening for the hollow sound that indicated heavy infestation. Many chose to eat their biscuits in the dark to avoid seeing exactly what they were consuming. Water was an even more serious problem than food. Fresh water was stored in wooden casks that quickly developed algae, bacteria, and other contaminants. After just a few weeks at sea, the water became thick, green, and foul-smelling. Sailors had to strain it through cloth to remove the worst of the floating debris, but this did nothing about the taste or the health hazards. Many men preferred to drink their daily ration of rum or beer, which at least had alcohol content that killed some bacteria. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables quickly led to scurvy, a disease that killed more sailors than all other causes combined. Scurvy began with fatigue and weakness, then progressed to swollen, bleeding gums and loose teeth. Wounds stopped healing properly, old injuries reopened, and eventually victims died from internal bleeding or overwhelming infection. What made scurvy particularly horrifying was its progressive nature. Sailors watched their own bodies deteriorate over months, knowing that death was approaching but powerless to stop it. Their teeth fell out, making it even harder to eat the poor food available. Their joints swelled and became painful, making the physical demands of shipboard work unbearable. Some men became so weak they could barely stand, yet they were still expected to perform their duties or face punishment for malingering. Dysentery was another constant threat, spread by contaminated water and poor sanitation. The ship's toilet facilities consisted of a few holes cut in the bow of the ship, with seawater washing underneath to carry waste away. These facilities, called the heads, offered no privacy and were often unusable in rough weather. Men suffering from dysentery faced the choice between making dangerous trips to the heads in storms or fouling themselves where they lay. Typhus, spread by lice and fleas that thrived in the crowded, dirty conditions below deck, could sweep through a ship's crew like wildfire. Men burning with fever lay in their hammocks while their shipmates continued working around them. There was no isolation, no treatment, and no relief. Those who survived typhus often suffered permanent damage to their hearts, kidneys, or nervous systems. The ship's rats carried their own diseases and consumed precious food supplies that could mean the difference between life and death on a long voyage. Some ships carried cats to control the rat population, but the cats themselves were often diseased and became another source of infection. Sailors learned to sleep with their food rations tied to their bodies to prevent rats from stealing them during the night. Personal hygiene was virtually impossible to maintain. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing, and seawater was too harsh for regular use on skin and hair. Sailors wore the same clothes for weeks or months, until their garments literally rotted off their bodies. Lice infested everyone from the captain to the lowest seaman, and scratching at lice bites left open wounds that became infected in the ship's dirty environment. The physical demands of sailing never ceased, regardless of weather conditions or the crew's state of health. Sails had to be adjusted constantly as wind conditions change, requiring men to climb the rigging in all weather. The ropes and blocks used to control the sails were heavy and awkward, demanding coordinated effort from multiple sailors working in perfect timing. During storms, the work became genuinely life-threatening. Sailors had to venture onto yards that pitched and rolled with the ship's movement, working with frozen hands to furl sails that fought against them with tremendous force. Ice formed on the rigging in cold weather, making every surface slippery and treacherous. Men fell regularly, either to the deck below or into the sea, and rescue was rarely possible. The psychological toll of this existence was enormous. Men lived in constant fear of storms, of disease, of punishment, of death. They were cut off from everything familiar, with no news from home and no certainty that they would ever see land again. Letters from family, even if they arrived at ports along the way, might be months or years old by the time sailors received them. Depression and despair were common, though they weren't recognized as medical conditions. Men who couldn't cope with the stress sometimes threw themselves overboard rather than continue enduring shipboard life. Others retreated into themselves, becoming barely functional members of the crew who performed their duties mechanically while their minds sought escape from unbearable reality. The few entertainment options available were crude and often dangerous. Sailors told stories, sang songs, and played simple gambling games to pass the time during calm weather. But alcohol was often involved in these activities, and drunken arguments frequently escalated into violence. Fighting among crew members was common and could result in serious injuries that the ship's primitive medical facilities couldn't properly treat. Religious services, when they occurred, were brief and practical rather than comforting. Chaplains were rare on merchant ships, and even naval vessels often made do with officers reading from prayer books. Death was so common that burial services became routine, with bodies sewn into canvas shrouds and dropped overboard with minimal ceremony. Death at sea came in many forms, and sailors learned to live with the constant knowledge that each day might be their last. The ocean itself was an implacable enemy that showed no mercy to human weakness or error. Ships were fragile wooden constructions held together with rope, tar, and hope, sailing through environments that could destroy them in minutes. Storms were the most dramatic killers, but not necessarily the most common. When a major storm struck, ships became hell on earth. Massive waves crashed over the deck, sweeping away anything and anyone not securely fastened down. The The ship would pitch and roll so violently that men couldn't stand, much less work the sails and rigging necessary to keep the vessel under control. During these storms, sailors had to venture onto the deck and into the rigging, despite conditions that made survival a matter of pure luck. Waves 30 feet high or more would wash over the ship without warning, and anyone caught in the open might be carried away in an instant. The lucky ones died quickly from drowning or being dashed against the ship's structure. The unlucky ones were swept overboard and left to die slowly in the churning sea, watching their ship disappear into the storm. But storms were just the most visible threat. Disease killed far more sailors than weather ever did. Scurvy alone accounted for more deaths than all other causes combined on some voyages. Men would start the journey healthy and strong, only to waste away over months as their bodies consumed themselves from the inside out. The progression of scurvy was horrifying to witness. It began with fatigue and weakness that men often attributed to the hard work and poor food. Then came the bleeding gums and loose teeth, followed by reopening of old wounds and the appearance of strange bruises all over the body. In the final stages, victims became so weak they couldn't leave their hammocks, lying in their own waste while their shipmates continued working around them. Typhus could spread through a ship's crew with devastating speed, especially during long voyages when hygiene conditions deteriorated beyond the point where the disease could be contained. Men would burn with fever while lying in hammocks, soaked with their own sweat and excrement. Delirium was common, and dying men would rave about seeing family members or imaginary threats that seemed real to their fevered minds. Dysentery killed through dehydration and exhaustion, as victims lost fluids faster than they could replace them with the ship's contaminated water supply. Men suffering from severe dysentery would waste away visibly, their eyes sinking into their skulls and their skin taking on a grayish pallor that experienced sailors recognized as a sign of approaching death. Accidents were a constant threat in an environment where everything was designed to harness tremendous natural forces. The ropes and blocks used to control sails could crush limbs or snap and kill men instantly. Sailors working aloft faced the constant risk of falls that were almost always fatal. The ship's cannons, if it carried them, were massive pieces of iron that could break loose in rough weather and crush anyone in their path. Even simple tasks, like moving cargo or working with the ship's anchors, could result in serious injuries. A rope under tension could snap and whip across the deck with enough force to decapitate a man. Heavy barrels and crates could shift suddenly in rough seas, pinning or crushing sailors who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Fire was perhaps the most feared disaster at sea, because it offered no escape. Ships were made of wood, tar, and canvas, all highly flammable materials. A single lamp knocked over in rough seas, or a spark from the galley fire could turn a ship into an inferno within minutes. Men trapped below deck by flames had no choice but to burn to death or throw themselves into the sea and drown. Medical emergencies that would be minor inconveniences on land became death sentences at sea. A broken bone that became infected could lead to gangrene and amputation, if the ship even had someone capable of performing surgery. More often, men with serious injuries simply died slowly while their shipmates watched helplessly. Appendicitis, kidney stones, heart attacks, any condition requiring immediate medical attention meant almost certain death when the nearest doctor was thousands of miles away. Ships carried basic medical supplies, but these were often limited to bandages, crude surgical instruments, and various medicines of questionable effectiveness. The psychological pressure of living with constant death took its own toll. Some men simply gave up, losing the will to live when faced with unbearable conditions and no hope of relief. They would stop eating, stop working, and retreat into themselves until they died of what modern doctors might recognize as severe depression. Suicide was more common than official records indicated, partly because it was considered a sin that would prevent a man from receiving proper burial, and partly because it was often impossible to distinguish from accidental death in the chaotic environment of a ship at sea. Men would throw themselves overboard during storms or arrange accidents with the ship's rigging when they couldn't endure any more suffering. Yet, despite all these horrors, some men not only survived, but thrived in the maritime environment. These survivors developed a fatalistic attitude that helped them cope with daily exposure to death and suffering. They learned to focus on immediate survival rather than long-term planning, taking each day as it came and not allowing themselves to think too much about the future. Experience made an enormous difference in survival rates. Men who learned quickly how to move safely around the ship, how to conserve their strength, and how to avoid unnecessary risks had much better chances of living through a voyage. They learned to sleep whenever possible, to eat whatever food was available regardless of its condition, and to stay alert for the signs of approaching danger. The bonds formed between survivors were unlike anything experienced on land. Men who endured months of shared suffering together developed loyalties that transcended normal social boundaries. They looked out for each other, shared resources when possible, and provided emotional support during the darkest moments of their voyages. So why did men continue to go to sea when they knew the horrific conditions they would face? For most, it wasn't really a choice. Poverty, debt, legal troubles, or simple lack of alternatives drove them to the docks where recruiters waited. Some were literally forced into service by press gangs that kidnapped them off the streets. But there were other motivations as well. The sea offered the possibility of adventure and fortune that couldn't be found in the rigid class structure of 18th century society. A clever and lucky sailor could advance through the ranks and eventually command his own vessel. Prize money from captured enemy ships could make a man wealthy overnight. Most importantly, the sea offered escape from creditors, from the law, from failed relationships, from the suffocating limitations of life on land. For many men, even the horrors of shipboard life seemed preferable to the certain misery they would face if they stayed at home. The sailors who endured these conditions were among the toughest humans who ever lived, and their sacrifices helped build the global economy that connects our modern world.